You're about to listen to a snippet of the Terra Incognita podcast. For the full episode, please click on the Patreon link below. Okay, thank you very much. This is episode 3 of my series on the discovery of Australia. In the last episode, we spoke about Europe in the Middle Ages, how it had been a relatively isolated and self-contained society, whose knowledge of what lay beyond its own geographic boundaries was more fantasy than fact. We then spoke about the Portuguese explorers and how they managed to destroy Islam's monopoly on trade with the East by creating a new trade route. Soon, the Portuguese tried to establish their own monopoly on trade with the East. They travelled as far afield as Timor and Java in search of precious spices that they would sell on the European market. We also discussed the theory that the Portuguese discovered Australia. This theory is controversial, but one thing is not controversial, namely, the fact that the Portuguese set the discovery of Australia in motion. In this episode, we will talk about the role that the Spanish played in the discovery of Australia. I hope you enjoy it. Now, out the front of virtually every government building in Australia, you will see 3 flags. The Australian flag, the Aboriginal flag, and the Torres Strait Islander flag. The Torres Strait is a waterway that separates North Australia from the island of New Guinea. In that waterway, there are at least 274 small islands. These islands are called the Torres Strait Islands. Now, Torres Strait Islanders and Aboriginals are often conflated. People think of them as the same people and mention them in the same sentence. But Torres Strait Islanders are actually very different from Aboriginals. Aboriginals were nomadic, which is to say they had not undergone the farming revolution. They hunted and gathered. Torres Strait Islanders, by contrast, were already farming when Europeans first arrived. They cultivated crops like yams, taro, and bananas. This agricultural practice meant they had a relatively stable food supply and were less reliant on hunting and gathering. Another thing to point out is the different attitude these two groups have towards Europeans. Today, Aboriginals generally have a negative view of Europeans and European settlement. Many of them consider Australia Day a day of mourning. But in the Torres Strait Islands, the arrival of the Europeans is called the Coming of the Light. And every year, on the 1st of July, Torres Strait Islanders celebrate the Coming of the Light, which commemorates the arrival of the London Missionary Society. This day is an island-specific public holiday, and many Torres Strait Islanders come together to celebrate it. But none of this is really relevant to our discussion. What is relevant is the fact that the Torres Strait is named after a Spanish explorer. Why do a bunch of islands between Australia and New Guinea owe their name to a Spanish explorer? This question will be dealt with in this episode. Between 1567 and 1607, Spain conducted 3 voyages in search of what they called Terra Australis, or the Great South Land. The 3 main men associated with this search were Álvaro de Montaña, Pedro Fernández de Quiros, and Luis Vaz de Torres, who we have already mentioned. Now, I suspect that I just mispronounced all of their names, but all you need to know at this point is that the 3 main guys are Montaña, Quiros, and Torres. Before I talk about each of these men in more detail, I'm going to give a bit of background information. I'll speak briefly about the rise of Spain and what drove the Spanish to explore the Pacific Ocean, and then we'll get into each of those 3 men. So, Spain, like Portugal, had been under Islamic control for much of its history, but in the 15th century, it too began to drive the Muslims back. In the late 15th century, the Spanish kingdom of Castile united the disunited Iberian Peninsula under a single kingdom. We spoke about Castile in the last episode. This small Iberian kingdom had fought a war with Portugal, which it had lost. In 1469, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile were married. Their marriage led to the unification of Aragon and Castile and the creation of Spain. This new Spanish kingdom was virile, fierce, and passionately devoted to the Christian faith. It was completely committed to removing the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. In 1492, they conquered the Moorish capital at Granada and drove the Muslims out of Europe. Christopher Columbus was present at this battle. He watched the Spanish push the Moors out of Iberia and claim Granada as part of Spain. Columbus would go on to expand this territory even more by discovering a new world, one that Spain would claim for herself. Spain would go on to discover and explore both of the Americas and change the whole world's idea of geography. She conquered half of the United States, all Mexico, Central America, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Paraguay, Peru, Chile, and New Granada. Her language spread across this new world and is spoken there till this day. The Spanish were the first Europeans to see and explore the greatest gulf in the world. They were the first Europeans who discovered the two greatest rivers. They found the greatest ocean and discovered that America was made up of two continents. It was the Spanish who were the first to sail around the world. But these achievements were not enough for them. The incredible wealth of Spain's American conquests did not satiate them. They craved more treasure, and they were convinced that it could be discovered on an undiscovered continent in the South Seas. As was said in the previous episode, many European scholars during the Renaissance believed that there was a vast continent in the Southern Seas, a terra incognita waiting to be discovered. This academic idea appeared to be supported by rumors that the Spanish heard whilst in Peru. In Peruvian folklore, there was a story about an emperor who left Peru and sailed south into the Pacific Ocean. After a year away, he returned with gold, slaves, and other valuable trophies. Many Spanish explorers associated this Peruvian tale with the Bible. In the Bible, King Solomon of Israel got his gold, silver, and precious stones from a place called Ophir. The exact location of Ophir is not known today and was not known then. But in the 16th century, many Spaniards became convinced that King Solomon had been getting his gold from an island in the Pacific Ocean. This belief explains why the Solomon Islands are called the Solomon Islands. So the Spanish were inspired to explore the Pacific because of these rumors of gold. They thought, that King Solomon's mines could be found in the Pacific Ocean. But they were also inspired by their religious fervor. Spain had fought for centuries against the tide of Islamic invasion and occupation in Spain and elsewhere, and many Spaniards saw themselves as the champions of Christendom, crusaders morally charged with bringing Catholicism to the non-Christian world. The religious convictions of the Spaniards of this time inspired them to search for souls that could be saved. If there was a huge continent in the south, as Ptolemy had suggested, it would likely be well inhabited. The Spanish could convert these people to Christianity. So the Spanish desire for both gold and souls led them into the Pacific Ocean. Spain was well situated to explore this ocean. The Pacific was immediately accessible from the ports of Spain's American colonies, but remote from the maritime reach of other European nations. The first European to explore this ocean was Magellan. Magellan was of Portuguese extraction, but he commanded a Spanish fleet. In 1520, he drove through the strait that bears his name and plunged into a foreign ocean. After going through the Strait of Magellan on the southern tip of South America, he entered new waters. This ocean appeared calm to Magellan, and hence he named it the Pacific Ocean. Magellan described the Pacific as, and I quote, "a sea so vast that the human mind can scarcely grasp it," end quote. After months in this gigantic ocean, he had only found a few unfortunate islands. But in 1521, after years of struggle against overwhelming odds, Magellan discovered the Philippines. He introduced the Catholic faith to those islands, which continues to be practiced there till this day. But ultimately he lost his life in this land during a mad crusade against the heathen. He died, but his legacy lived on. Expeditions to conquer and colonize the Philippines left from Mexico a few years after Magellan's death, and a permanent Spanish presence in the islands was established, chiefly in Manila. Manila became the Pacific headquarters of the Spanish Empire, and the stretch of ocean between the Americas and the Philippines was often referred to as the Spanish Sea. Over the next century, the Spanish would commit themselves to exploring this ocean.
Look, when you realize how fake it all is, the football, the basketball, the Lady Gaga, the Justin Bieber, who gives you these carbon tax messages. They tell your kids they got to love Justin Bieber, and then Bieber says, hand in your guns, pass the Cybersecurity Act, and the police state's good, and then your children are turned into mindless vassals who now they look up to some twit instead of looking up to Thomas Jefferson or looking up to Nikola Tesla or looking up to Magellan. I mean, kids, Magellan's a lot cooler than Justin Bieber. He circumnavigated with one ship the entire planet. He was killed by wild natives before they got back to Portugal, and when they got back, there was only like 11 people alive of the 200 and something crew, and the entire ship was rotting down to the waterline. That's destiny. That's will. That's striving. That's being a trailblazer and explorer. Going into space, mathematics, quantum mechanics, the secrets of the universe. It's all there. Life is fiery with its beauty. It's incredible detail. Tuning into it. They want to shatter your mind talking about Justin Bieber.
I couldn't mention Magellan and then not play that clip. It had to be done. Anyway, the next Spanish discovery that I want to talk about, the next Spanish discovery in the Pacific, that is the Solomon Islands. As I've already said, Peruvian folklore spoke about an emperor who traveled for a year in the Pacific and returned with gold, silver, and slaves. Upon hearing this story, the Spanish became convinced that King Solomon had gotten his gold from an island in the Pacific. This greatly interested them, and they began searching the Pacific for King Solomon's mines. The Spanish made 3 separate voyages in search of these mines. The first 2 voyages were led by Mendena, and the last voyage was led by both Quiros and Torres. So we'll begin by discussing Mendena. Mendena was born in Spain, but moved to Peru at the age of 17. When he turned 25, the inexperienced young man was entrusted with an expedition into the Pacific. He had a crew of about 160 men, 70 of whom were soldiers. One document states that almost all the soldiers were criminals, one under sentence of death. Why were there so many criminals on board this ship? Spain had developed a policy of encouraging criminals to join journeys of exploration. This helped Spain maintain law and order within their colonies, but it often made journeys of exploration volatile and dangerous. In addition to the soldiers, there was also miners, priests, and African slaves. In 1567, this motley crew left Peru and sailed southwest into an unknown ocean. After several months at sea, Mendena and his crew discovered what we now know as the Solomon Islands. These islands are about 1,200 kilometers northeast of Australia. By the afternoon, they approached one of the islands. It was a mountainous, jungle-clad island with a white sandy beach. As they got close to the shoreline, they were confronted by native warriors in canoes. Mendenya describes them as ready for war, carrying bows and arrows, spears and wooden clubs. 24 of them climbed up the ropes on the ship's side. The warriors were naked and very dark. Many of them had painted faces. The Spaniards embraced them and offered food and drink. Wine and biscuit were rejected, but meat was consumed. The explorers distributed various little gifts and were delighted when one of their visitors repeated after them the Lord's Prayer, pronouncing the Spanish very well. Mendenya gave the man a shirt. Less welcome was the theft of objects which the natives flung overboard to be retrieved by those still in the canoes. Mendenya offered one man wine in a silver cup. He refused the wine but kept the cup. Another had to be prevented from seizing a ship's bell. One man climbed at the mast with such speed that Mendenya remarked that he would make an excellent sailor. At first, the relationship between the newcomers and the islanders was amicable. Gifts were exchanged. Coconuts were traded for Spanish goods. The native warriors danced on board the ship when they first heard the guitar. Each group attempted to learn something of the language of the other. The Spaniards continued to live aboard their ships, but came onto the white sandy beach to celebrate Mass. They realized that the land was heavily populated. People appeared in crowds of several hundred. There were numerous separate territories, some at war with each other, and many, the Spaniards were told, fiercely opposed to them. They soon learned that 11 or 12 chiefs were determined to kill and eat them. This was probably the Europeans' first realization that they were among cannibals. This realization became all the more real one day when the Spaniards were at Mass on the beach. Whilst they prayed, a fleet of 14 canoes arrived. The men got out of their canoes and offered the Spaniards a gift. The gift was a quarter of a dead boy with the arm and hand, along with some yams, which they urged Mendenya to eat. Some of the shocked soldiers prepared to open fire, but Mendenya restrained them. Later he wrote, and I quote, "I accepted the present, and, being greatly grieved that there should be this pernicious custom in that country, and that they should suppose that we ate it, I caused a grave to be dug at the water's edge, and had the quarter buried in his..." He's talking about the chief who offered him the gift. So in his presence, seeing that we set no value on the present, they all bent down over their canoes like men vexed or offended, and put off and withdrew with their heads bent down. Now, soon after this event, relations began to sort of break down. The natives stopped trading with the Spanish. The Spanish would call out to them and try and display, trade goods, but this, didn't bring about any response. The men began to struggle to get food as a consequence. They began foraging in an attempt to find food, and one day whilst they were out foraging, 4 of them were attacked by some 100 warriors. The outnumbered Spanish began firing at the natives, and this drove them off. But one soldier actually had his leg bitten in the process. And this soldier was convinced that the native warrior was trying to eat him. The miners ran into similar issues. Whilst panning for gold, they were attacked from the higher banks and hillsides. Violence began to actually escalate. A group of Spaniards searching for water were attacked as they were loading water jars into their boats. They were totally overwhelmed. The entire group was slain and their bodies dismembered, some beheaded, others with tongues sliced off and skulls opened for the brains within. Only one man survived this ordeal. Mendenya is generally described as a humane man who wanted to establish good relations with the natives, but after this event, his humanity seems to have crumbled. In retaliation for what the natives had done, the Spanish burned hundreds of houses and shot, killed, and wounded many natives. They also beheaded many of the natives and left their heads close to the place where the watering party had been slain. So the relationship between the Spanish and the natives totally broke down and became increasingly hostile. On one of the islands, great excitement gripped the Spanish soldiers when they thought they had found gold. People claimed to have seen warriors fighting with clubs made of gold. This was a baseless rumor, but it spread far and wide nevertheless. In the inns and the taverns of Peru, the rumor lingered for years. Furthermore, the miners of this expedition were certain that there was gold to be found on these islands, but they were never truly able to look for this gold because of the constant ambushes by the natives. The lack of food and constant war forced Mendenya to return to Peru. After 22 months abroad, Mendenya and his men arrived back in Peru. Close to half the men who set out on this journey were dead. The men of this expedition had achieved very little after 2 years. They had discovered the Solomon Islands, but they had created no colony, found no spices or precious metals, and made no converts to Christianity. And they had discovered no vast southern continent to yield wealth and power to Spain. Yet Mendenya's belief in Terra Australis incognita was unshaken. Perhaps driven by the very fact of his failure, he became obsessively determined to return to the island and establish a Spanish colony. From this base, the base of the Solomon Islands, he believed he would discover the great southern continent. The islands that Mendenya had discovered came to be known as the Solomon Islands because of the rumors of gold, and the name has stuck till this day. So the colonization of the Solomon Islands and the discovery of the great southern continent became Mendenya's life obsession. He hoped that the King of Spain would fund this obsession, and so he described the Solomon Islands as attractively as he possibly could. He said that the islands had cloves, ginger, nutmeg, pearls, and gold, even though they had discovered none of those things during their expedition. He would continue to petition the king for years to come. These petitions were rejected, but the king eventually granted him royal sanction. In 1595, he once again left Peru and headed southwest. There were some stark differences between this voyage and the earlier voyage into the Pacific. This time, Mendenya was not a young man, but a man in his 50s. He was married and brought his wife on this second voyage. His second expedition was larger than his first. He sailed with 354 men, women, and children, close to twice the number of crew that he had brought on the first expedition. These men were carried away from Peru on 4 ships, but some things remained the same. Once again, the voyage consisted of a large number of criminals from Peru. This expedition was even less successful than the first. After months at sea, Mendenya was unable to rediscover the Solomon Islands. Instead, he found a group of islands which he called the Santa Cruz Islands. On one of these islands, Mendenya attempted to establish a Spanish colony. This colony would serve as a base for further exploration. He hoped that from Santa Cruz, he could rediscover the Solomon Islands and later discover Terra Australis incognita. The men built huts on the island and eventually a church. Once the building was complete, they moved from their ships to the encampment. Originally, the Spanish had no problems with the natives of Santa Cruz, who even helped them in the building process, but this did not last very long. Mendenya had ordered his men to respect the natives and their property, but the men, being criminals, ignored these orders. They began killing the natives and taking their property, which infuriated Mendenya. They also began to question Mendenya's authority. They were dissatisfied with almost everything. They were tired, hungry, and sick. It seems likely that malaria was spreading among them. An increasing number of men wanted to leave the island and find a better place to go. An atmosphere of rebellion began to spread among them. This atmosphere of rebellion is described in the diaries of Quiros, who we are going to talk about in a lot more detail in a moment. Quiros is the most important character when it comes to the Spanish search for Terra Australis. But at the moment, all you need to know is that Quiros was a captain of one of the 4 ships of Mendenya's expedition. He went and spoke to the men one day in an attempt to address their concerns. This is how he describes the interaction. I am reading from the diary of Quiros now. Some were saying, "Where have you brought us to? What place is this where no man goes? We came to take gold, silver, pearls, or other things of value, and these are not here." Others said, "We did not come to sow. For that purpose there is plenty of land in Peru. Embark us and take us to seek those other islands, or take us to Peru or some part where there are Christians." Okay, end quote. Quiros reminded them that Rome and Venice were once, and again I'm quoting, forests or bare plains, end quote. Quiros told them that abandoning their enterprise made them enemies of God and King. This doesn't appear to have gone down too well. After calling these men the enemies of God and King, 7 or 8 of them went for their swords. But somehow, tempers cooled, Quiros returned to the ship, but nothing had changed. The encampment was still in a mutinous mood. A number of other men attempted to make peace with the mutinous soldiers, but peace did not come. People had chosen sides. Those who remained loyal to Mendenya wanted to establish a base or colony in Santa Cruz. Those who were against him wanted to leave the island to sail to either the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, or Peru. These 2 factions eventually came to blows. Mendenya claimed that those who wanted to leave were traitors to both king and country, and he began killing them. The 2 factions came to blows. Quiros describes the conflict as follows. The men were like lunatics, going about with their eyes, seeking those who they could kill, shouting with drawn swords. This was a day for avenging injuries. End quote. Amid the clashing of weapons and the screams and shouting, the women cowered in terror, weeping, praying for their men. The traitors were beheaded and their severed heads were put up on poles. Mendenya successfully put down this rebellion, but he died only a few days after it. He was one of many people who would end up dying from malaria, which had, in part, caused the rebellion in the first place. After he died, his wife, Isabel, became the governor of the colony. This colony was in dire straits when she took control of it. They had just put down a rebellion, and the settler population was being decimated by malaria. 2 out of every 3 people were dying each day. After fighting and killing those who had proposed leaving, the mere handful of surviving settlers themselves decided that they had to leave. Isabel, as governor, directed the captains to sail to the Philippines. Quiros was put in charge of directing the ship to the Philippines. Without a chart, Quiros could only steer west, hoping that he would find that country. On the journey to the Philippines, people continued to die. Bodies went overboard almost daily, sometimes several times a day. People were also starving. To make matters worse, Isabel remained in her cabin during the entire trip, consuming the ship's limited food and water. Quiros pleaded for a share for the men, but she refused. After a 12-week voyage from Santa Cruz Islands to the Philippines, 50 people had died. Of the approximately 378 people who had sailed from Peru, about 100 remained. The expedition had been an almost total failure. The voyage had not discovered the Great Southern Land. It had not even rediscovered the Solomons. and 200 years passed before the Solomons were once again seen by European eyes, to quote Lord Amherst of Hackney. In the history of travel, there is probably no other instance of the veil being lifted for a brief moment to afford a glimpse of the life of an isolated island race, and then dropped again for nigh 3 centuries, during which no ripple from the outer world came to disturb the silent backwater. Even though the expedition was a total failure, the idea of the Great Southern Continent did not die. The mission to find the Great Southern Land was assumed by Quiros, who we just briefly discussed. We will discuss him in greater detail now. After spending 2 years at sea in search of the Great South Land, Quiros arrived in the Philippines. He was one of a few people that survived this voyage, which had been a total disaster. Many had died, including the leader of the voyage, and little had been discovered. Yet Quiros was more determined than ever to discover this fabled continent. In 1597, after arriving back in Peru after a treacherous couple of years, he wrote a letter to the Viceroy of Peru asking for a vessel of 70 tons and 40 sailors. With these things, he would return to discover those lands and many others that he believed existed in the South Seas. Like Mendenia, Quiros would devote the rest of his life to the pursuit of finding Terra Australis incognita. Terra means land, Australis means south, and incognita means unknown. Like Mendenia, the search for this continent would consume him. The rest of his life would be characterized by almost endless disappointment and desperate poverty. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit more about the man. Who was this man who had committed himself to Mendenia's dream of finding the mythical southern continent? He was born in 1565 in a city called Evora, which is in Portugal. Evora had been occupied by the Moors for almost 500 years. It was retaken by Christians in the 12th century. In 1580, Spain annexed Portugal. Quiros was about 15 years old when this happened. Later documents would refer to him as a Portuguese national, but he was clearly committed to Spain, so much so that he adopted the Spanish spelling of his name. We do not know anything about the first voyages that Quiros went on. At some point, he crossed the Atlantic and arrived at one of Spain's American colonies. Of his physical appearance, the only surviving remark occurs in a document written when he was in his 50s. He is described as a man with a bronzed complexion and a mole on his right nostril. As I just said, we don't really know much about his first voyages, but he clearly went on many, because by 1595, when he first comes into the light of history, he was regarded as a highly qualified seaman, so much so that Mendenia asked him to be the captain of one of his 4 ships. He also asked him to be the chief pilot of the expedition intended to create a Spanish colony in the Solomon Islands. Quiros accepted, and in 1595 he sailed with the expedition. He witnessed and recorded the debacle of the Spanish settlement in the Santa Cruz Islands, and with his incredible seamanship and navigational skills, he managed to bring the surviving settlers across an unknown, uncharted sea to the Philippines. During this tumultuous 2 years, Quiros's casual interest in Terra Australis transformed into a profound commitment to its discovery. Quiros was an experienced cartographer who would have been familiar with at least some of the world maps of his time, on several of which Terra Australis incognita indisputably covered the Earth's southern hemisphere. These undiscovered austral regions, he explained in a letter to the Viceroy, lay between the Cape of Good Hope and the Strait of Magellan, somewhere in the south. With a ship of 60 tons and a crew of 40, he was convinced that he could find this mainland. He was ready to be sent on a voyage of exploration. He believed that he was on the verge of making a discovery as great as that of Columbus. His initial letter to the Viceroy of Peru was ignored, so he wrote again, repeating his request, urging that he be sent without delay to discover the Southland and establish a settlement. He argued that he would bring vast dominions to the Spanish Empire and save millions of souls in this new world. but the Viceroy of Peru refused to assume responsibility for the expedition. He suggested that Quiros go to Spain to lay his plans before the king. In 1598, Quiros left Peru and began a long journey to Spain. He didn't arrive in Spain until 1600. Upon arriving, he found out that the newly married king was honeymooning with his wife and therefore unreachable. There was, however, an attractive alternative. The year 1600 was a Jubilee holy year in Rome, and Quiros, who hoped to seek spiritual favors from the Pope for those participating in his expedition, decided to visit the ancient city. He sold the little he possessed, bought the dress of a pilgrim, and, staff in hand, walked through the cities of Italy. Quiros ended up meeting with the Pope several times. He told the Pope about the great undiscovered Southland and its untold numbers of heathen people. The Pope listened to his plans attentively. He spoke about colonizing this southern continent with a fervent religious idealism. He spoke about spreading the Catholic faith throughout this new continent and saving millions of souls. The Pope was enthusiastic about this plan and believed Quiros was zealous, idealistic, and fully prepared to devote himself to the propagation of his faith. The Pope had no doubt that Quiros was a Christian seeking souls, not islands of gold. He wrote a letter to the King of Spain encouraging him to support Quiros's plan. Quiros was already a profoundly religious man, but these meetings with the Pope appear to have strengthened his religiosity. During his time in Rome, he became convinced that he had been singled out by God to bring Catholicism to Terra Australis incognita. When the King of Spain received the Pope's recommendation, he decided to support the plan. He ordered that Quiros be provided with 2 very good, well-equipped and well-provisioned ships without delay. In addition to this, he was to be provided with a crew, munitions and arms, goods for barter, and some priests. All costs were to be covered by the crown. For Quiros, what had become the ultimate goal of his life, the spiritual conquest of the mysterious Austral land, was in sight. The third Spanish voyage in search of the Southland set off in 1605. 3 ships left Peru in search of Terra Australis. In the 3 ships were nearly 300 men, sailors and soldiers. There was also artillery and provisions, including iron implements, fruits, and animals from Peru. They set off in search of a new continent that they would form a settlement on. The captain of one of the 3 ships was Luis Vaz de Torres. He was in charge of maintaining order on board his ship. Quiros gave Torres instructions on how to do this, and we still have those instructions. I'm going to quote them now. Men should not curse, nor blaspheme, nor say or do other things evil against God our Lord, nor against the most holy Mother, nor against angels, saints, or things sacred or divine. Anyone caught blaspheming is to be punished by forfeit of his day's ration, and, for the second offence, he may be put in irons and fined for the benefit of the souls in purgatory. Every day, in the afternoon, all the people are to go on their knees before an altar where are images of Christ and of the Virgin Mary. If any playing cards or dice are found, they are to be thrown overboard. He also gave Torres instructions on how to handle natives. He said, and I quote once again, "Avoid the danger of offending the natives or being offended by them. Spaniards should be as fathers to children, but the children must be watched as if they were known enemies. Our part is always to be in the right, with open and honest intentions. Then God will help us, as he helps all those whose objects are good." All 3 of the ships received these instructions before they set sail. I think these instructions make it pretty clear that Quiros saw this voyage as a chivalrous missionary enterprise. But his men had a very different view of the expedition, as we will soon find out. In 1605, these 300 men set out in search of Terra Australis. They had all received the instructions that I just described. After months at sea, heading southwest, they finally found land. This land appeared to be very large, with many mountains and plains. Indeed, it appeared so large that the Spaniards believed that they had arrived in the mythical southern continent. Men in canoes approached the ships and exchanged fruits and coconuts for Spanish goods. Repeatedly, the islanders called out and gestured for the Spaniards to land. They had arrived in modern-day Vanuatu, which is relatively close to both New Zealand and Australia. But they believed they had arrived in Terra Australis, the long-sought-after continent. The Spaniards landed and began walking through a forest. They found a clean, well-shaded road that led them to a native village. Round the huts were plantains, oranges, and yams. This foreign land appeared to yield a lot of food, and the climate was perfect. It was so cool at night that blankets were welcome. And in this earthly paradise, there were no snakes, ants, or mosquitoes. I am able to say, with good reason, writes Quiros, that a land more delightful, healthy, and fertile, a site better supplied with quarries, timber, clay for tiles, brick for founding a great city on the sea, with a port and a good river on a plain, with level lands near the hills, nor better adapted to raise plants and all that Europe and the Indies produce, could not be found. In short, he believed that this land would be the ideal site for the mother city of the southern world. Quiros believed that this land could easily support 200,000 Spaniards. He would establish a New Jerusalem in the south, a great and prosperous city that would be the capital of a new continent. And that's actually what he called this place that he had arrived at. He called it the New Jerusalem. There was, however, one problem with this New Jerusalem, and that was the natives. One of the Spaniards described the natives as follows. They are black, athletic men, woolly-headed, many of them with really pleasing faces, well armed with clubs and three-pronged spears barbed with human bones, which they throw to a great distance. Relations with the natives initially began well. Quiros believed that it was absolutely essential to establish peaceful relations with them. He did not want to repeat the same mistakes that his predecessor had made. But it did not take long for these peaceful relations to break down. A group of 70 Spaniards looking for materials to build with was reportedly attacked by 600 native warriors. Guns were fired and natives were hung from trees. Quiros was devastated by the violence. He believed that all men, regardless of color or culture, were God's creatures with immortal souls that needed only to be given the blessings of Christianity. He was motivated by a genuine missionary zeal. But most Spaniards did not share his attitudes towards the natives. To quote one Spaniard who witnessed the violence, I'm quoting now, "With such savages it is impossible to use politeness. They should not be so rude to Spaniards, to whom all the nations of the world pay respect." End quote. Following this altercation, the natives appeared to have abandoned the area. Only by night were they seen on the beach. By day, the Spaniards entered their deserted villages, which they found clean and well arranged. The houses, with few exceptions, were liberally stocked with food, to which the soldiers helped themselves. Quiros had been disheartened by the violence, but he quickly regained his optimism. One afternoon, he assembled the people of all three ships and made to them a triumphant speech. He told them that he had established a new chivalrous order called the Knights of the Holy Ghost, an order which Pope and King would give privileges in both this life and the next. The men were initiated into this order and became Knights of the Holy Ghost. Quiros did this because he believed that they were engaged in a chivalrous missionary enterprise. Every soldier and every sailor was on a nightly quest to bring Christianity to the southern continent. Now, being a knight is basically the same as being nobility, so it's kind of funny that Quiros made these men knights, because many of them were criminals. They were not the sort of men to frequently attend religious services or study the Bible. They were often trigger-happy men with criminal pasts. Quiros also knighted slaves from Africa. So in this foreign land, it appeared that everyone could become a knight. In the New Jerusalem, everyone and anyone was nobility. After the men were knighted, Quiros said, and I quote, this is from the speech, "Let the heavens, the earth, the waters, with all their creatures, and all those here present, witness that I, Captain Pedro Fernandez de Quiros, in the name of Jesus Christ, hoist this emblem of the Holy Cross, on which Jesus was crucified, and whereupon he gave his life, for the ransom and remedy of all the human race, on this day of Pentecost, the 14th of May, 1606, I take possession of all this part of the south, as far as the pole, in the name of Jesus, which from now on shall be called the southern land of the Holy Ghost." Now, after making this declaration, Quiros removed the execution block from the island. He argued that persons of nobility, knights of the Holy Ghost, on a chivalrous mission in the southern land, would not do anything that merited the punishment of execution. He began to talk about the church he planned to build in the New Jerusalem. He argued that it would rival that of St. Peter in Rome. His fervent idealism and chivalrous zeal inspired some of the men, but many of them listened to him with a sort of horror or bemusement. His idealism seemed totally detached from reality. They came to think of him as a sort of madman, a Don Quixote of the South Seas, someone of an exceeding idealism that was totally out of touch with reality. And that's actually how he is remembered till this day. If you search Don Quixote of the South Seas, his name will appear. Many of the leading men of the expedition came to distrust him for this reason. They worried that he was out of touch with reality. Now, as I've already said, many of the men thought that they had found the southern continent, Terra Australis. They now wanted to prove it. After 6 weeks in the New Jerusalem, 3 ships headed south to determine whether they were on a continent or an island. Now, here is where the historical accounts begin to diverge. Different people give different accounts of what happened. The ship that Quiros was on became separated from the other 2 ships and was unable to return to the New Jerusalem. Instead, it sailed back to Mexico. Some accounts claim this decision was made due to bad weather, but others claim it was due to a mutiny. One account in particular argues that the men on board that ship had rebelled against the deluded Don Quixote of the South Seas and sailed back to more familiar territories. So there's a historical debate that goes on. Had the ship left because of the weather, or had it left because of a mutiny? These questions have not only been asked by historians, they were also asked by the men on board the other 2 ships. Many of them who watched the ship sail away assumed mutiny. They were no doubt distressed, not only by the potential mutiny, but also by the fact that the ship they saw sailing away carried most of the expedition's trade goods, tools, and most of the medical supplies. It also carried Quiros away, who was the commander of the expedition. After 15 days of waiting for that ship to return, Torres decided to assume command of the expedition. He was immediately confronted with the question of what they were going to do. Would they return home, or would they continue to search for Terra Australis, as the king had demanded?